Hi, Rod Driver. Welcome back to 10 by 6.
Thanks very much for having me on again.
Our pleasure. This week we're looking at the selling of weapons. Last week we looked at the way in which terrorism and weapons of mass destruction are used to manipulate and control us through propaganda and exaggeration and hyperbole. Well, this week we're going to look specifically at the UK and the US, specifically in terms of their role of selling weapons, especially to countries that aren't necessarily probably the best proponents of democracy and civil society. So over to you, Rod.
Thanks very much for that introduction. So I find the weapons industry fascinating and that it contradicts so much of what politicians claim is important to them in world affairs. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So just to set the scene, to give everyone an understanding of the scale of what we're talking about. So the global expenditure on weapons is approximately 1.8 trillion US dollars per year. So that's actually approximately the same as the whole economy of Britain. And about a third of that is spent by the United States. So it has a far higher expenditure than any other country. Now, a chunk of that is international weapons sales to other countries. Now, it's estimated that the weapons sales totals approximately $100 billion per year. So it's a small proportion of the total, but it's still a huge amount of money. It's a very big industry. So the United States, again, is the biggest seller of weapons around the world. Britain also ranks highly. Its exact position in the rankings varies from year to year. Sometimes it's the second biggest, other times France or other countries sell just a little bit more than Britain does. So Britain and America both participate very actively in selling weapons to many other countries. And there are three sort of groups of reasons that I'm going to discuss for why Britain and America sell so many weapons. So the first group of reasons is about staying friendly with leaders overseas. It cements relationships with foreign militaries. It helps keep leaders in power. And sometimes it helps to get military leaders into power. And then there's a second aspect of the weapons industry that I want to spend a bit of time talking about, and that is that it is the most corrupt, secretive, and unaccountable industry in the world. And then the third area that I'm going to talk about is the political influence of very powerful weapons companies. So we'll discuss that's going to be the framework for tonight's presentation. So if we look at the first of those about supporting repressive regimes. So if you look at some of the most criminal countries in the last 50 years, one particularly stands out. There was a dictator in Indonesia called Suharto who committed genocide twice. Now you would expect that if countries like Britain and America take human rights seriously, they would be saying, well, this is unacceptable. We need to stop this happening. Now, in fact, we'll talk about human rights in a future week, and I will explain that human rights is actually completely irrelevant in British and American foreign policy, and weapon sales gives us sort of insight into this. But in fact, with Indonesia and Suharto, Britain and America actively supplied lots of weapons to him whilst he was committing genocide, but also they were providing intelligence to him whilst he was committing genocide to help him target his enemies. So this suggests that maybe human rights are not that important. Colombia is another country where America particularly has sold huge amounts of weapons whilst it has a terrible human rights record. And in fact, there was a study carried out in 2006. So Britain uses the term countries of concern to label other countries which have such a poor human rights record that Britain should not be selling weapons to them. And in this 2006 study, there were 20 countries of concern, and it included countries like Egypt and Nigeria, but actually Britain was selling weapons to 19 out of those 20 countries. So Britain wasn't even applying its own laws about countries that it should not sell to. And in fact, that has not changed. Evidence in the present day suggests that still continues, that in fact, when it comes to who we sell and don't sell to, there are really no laws that anybody with power takes seriously. So one of the things that people have noted is that there are some distinctions about it's legal to sell to some countries and not to others, or it's legal to sell some weapons, but it's illegal to sell others. Well, we're very lucky in Britain in that we probably have the leading expert on weapons sales in the world living here. He's called Andrew Feinstein. And his expertise is great in that not only does he research weapons sales, but some years ago, he was actually a member of the South African government, and he got to see firsthand the scale of corruption involved when Britain and other countries sell weapons to governments, and in this case, the South African government. And I'll give a little bit more detail about that in a minute. But he made a statement a few years ago saying that he has never come across a weapons deal that is not somewhat illegal. So the whole industry is corrupt. The whole system involves bribery and illegality. And you can see examples of this. So Britain actually sells weapons to the Channel Islands and to the Cayman Islands, both countries that have no militaries. And clearly those weapons are intended to go somewhere else, probably somewhere that has a terrible human rights record. But by selling it via these islands, you can hide the paper trail, so you can get away with selling something that should be illegal. And in the 1990s, there was a very famous set of events which were covered by the mainstream press, where Britain was trying to sell Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, who again had a terrible human rights record, a super gun. And people started to find out about this. And our politicians clearly have no problem about selling weapons to anybody who wants them, essentially. And in the 1980s, America had its most sort of famous or notorious sort of scandal in relation to weapons deals with what was called the Iran-Contra affair, where it was selling weapons to Iran and then transferring the money through fake companies and offshore accounts, and then actually supplying them to the Contras. That was a sort of group of people in Nicaragua who were trying to overthrow the government there. So we can see there's all sorts of different ways in which Britain and America get involved in illegal activities related to weapons deals. And what you realize is that almost everything politicians say about the weapons industry tends to actually sort of fall apart when you scrutinize it. So for example, sometimes we'll have a contract with another country, and the contract will say that we're providing, let's say, some aeroplanes. We're providing them as training aeroplanes, so to help people learn to fly. But what is never mentioned is that when we have a contract to supply an aeroplane, we also supply the spare parts necessary to change that aeroplane into a ground attack aeroplane. And everybody knows full well that when you make promises that this training aeroplane will never be used to attack people, it's just smoke and mirrors. It's not true. So somebody did a big study on corruption in all industries a few years back. They concluded that approximately 40% of all corruption globally is in the weapons trade. And you have to remember there are many other industries, the banking sector, the pharmaceutical sector, which are astonishingly corrupt, with fines of hundreds of billions of dollars. So for the weapons trade to be even more corrupt than those trades is an indication of that it is incredibly corrupt. It's a very, very criminal system. And this corruption affects both buyers and sellers. So if we look at one of the more famous cases in Britain, British Aerospace sold equipment to Saudi Arabia, and it is estimated that this involved approximately £6 billion pounds worth of bribes from British Aerospace to the Saudis to persuade them to buy these weapons. And some of the bribes actually came back to the head of British Aerospace in the form of kickbacks involving 2 expensive flats in London. So an incredibly corrupt deal. The Serious Fraud Office in Britain tried to investigate this, but the British government stepped in to shut down the investigation. So what you realize is the British government doesn't really care how corrupt this system is. It's actively participating in that system. And then Andrew Feinstein, who I talked about a little bit earlier, when he was within the South African government, he's discussed a major deal between British Aerospace and the South African government, which involves 300 million pounds of bribes. And he goes into quite a lot of detail, and he points out that all decisions about buying weapons were taken by 6 ministers. And in fact, the Queen of England invited all 6 ministers aboard her yacht to help lubricate the deal. So most people are unaware that one of the roles of the Queen is to help with weapon sales to other countries. So the South African government became incredibly corrupt from that moment onwards. And in fact, so the African National Congress, which is the group that were involved in this deal, have been engulfed in corruption ever since. And in fact, Jacob Zuma, the head of state at the time, there were 700 prosecutions against him in relation to this deal, but all of those prosecutions were dropped. The only thing that came out of this was that British Aerospace were given a fine of £500,000. Now, whilst that sounds like a lot, when you're talking about enormous arms deals worth billions and billions, a fine of £500,000 is just a drop in the ocean. It's trivial. It has no effect whatsoever. So if you look at sort of more general international discussions, there are attempts to control certain types of weapons sales. So, for example, various people have tried to end the sales of landmines. What you realize is that the US and Britain go to great lengths to try and avoid signing these into law and to avoid sort of applying them and enforcing them and so on. So they don't ratify them, they find loopholes. So for example, in Britain, we simply renamed landmines as cluster munitions, and Britain continued to sell them. Most recent example I've seen documented was in 2016 to Saudi Arabia, but it seems highly likely that that's still continuing. So they'll go to great lengths to avoid having any limitations on their ability to sell weapons. Okay, so the final area that I want to discuss is the relationship between weapons companies and governments. And in fact, President Eisenhower, the American president, in 1961, gave a very important speech where he said, "We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportion. We must not fail to comprehend its grave implication in councils of government. We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex." So it's really important to understand this idea of a military-industrial complex. That's where political decisions are influenced because of the power of weapons companies. And this is the system that we have today. So weapons companies are incredibly powerful themselves, but they are also very, very closely connected to government. Now, this is better documented in the States than it is over here. So people have noted that 1/4 of American senators or members of Congress have shares in weapons companies. And there's an incredibly powerful, what's called a revolving door, where people move between government and business. So one study showed that 84% of retiring American generals go on to take senior positions in weapons companies. So that's the vast majority of retiring US generals go to work from weapons companies. And we also see that senior government officials from weapons companies, they start out at weapons companies, they go and work for the government, and they have a very important role in government. And these days, in fact, some people have simultaneous roles. And one commentator said, it's impossible to tell where the government ends and Lockheed begins. So Lockheed is one of the biggest and most influential American weapons companies. And they're just so tightly integrated in government, there really is no clear separation between the two. And if you look in Britain, when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, in fact, he played an important role trying to sell weapons overseas, and that included to Saudi Arabia, to India, and to Zimbabwe. And those are just a few of the cases that have been clearly documented. So again, we see the Prime Minister and senior ministers in Britain playing an important role in selling weapons. So it's essentially an extension of the state, and it can be as criminal as it wants to be. There are no laws that can hold those companies to account. Now, Naomi Klein wrote about the concept of disaster capitalism a few years ago. And she did a chapter looking at weapons companies, and she noted that they now own healthcare companies that get involved in treating people who are wounded in war zones. They own construction companies that can make a lot of profits from rebuilding in war zones. And they own security companies which are making a lot of profit back home in Britain and America because of our fear of terrorism, which we discussed last week was a good example of an exaggerated threat. And in fact, what the information coming out of Afghanistan sort of ties in with this is that for 20 years, America has been occupying Afghanistan. And instead of trying to create a sort of functioning modern state, basically there were just lots and lots of people sort of feeding at the trough, taking government money in various forms of fraud and backhanders and corruption to line their pockets out of war. And America has basically created a permanent war economy. So many companies in America are now highly dependent on US government spending related to to wars and the military. And in fact, various people have documented for many years that America develops ever more complex and expensive weapons systems that appear to have no purpose. So during the Cold War in the 20th century with Russia, there were very complex nuclear weapons systems. So one that was particularly noted was called the MX missile. Now, it turned out that nobody actually wanted this missile, just engineers could build it. And so they made it. And in the end, very few were actually deployed. But in fact, we see a pattern to the present day where various military systems, so the Seawolf submarine, the V-22 tilt rotor aircraft, which some of you may see occasionally in Hollywood movies, which has a sort of, can take off like a helicopter and then fly forwards. And then the F-35, which is the most modern jet, all of them, people have questioned why they exist at all. And in fact, the F-35 consistently fails in its test flights. And yet the US government is spending an estimated $1.5 trillion on developing them. And other governments, including Britain, have various contracts to buy them in the foreseeable future. And one of the things that again has been noted in relation to weapons companies in America particularly is that all of the big American companies defraud the US government by overcharging them. So most famously, one company was charging $2,000 for a nut and a bolt that should have cost a few cents and things like this. So it's a whole system that's gone completely rogue. As we said at the beginning, there's basically no oversight of the whole system. So it's important to understand that there are no ethics at all. So we see countless examples of governments selling weapons to both sides in a war. So the most well documented of this would be India and Pakistan, which have been locked in a stalemate over a region known as Kashmir for many years. And Britain and America supply weapons to both sides. And it's a great opportunity for weapons companies to make very high profits by fueling war. And if we look in, say, Yemen, what you realize is that Britain, America, and France are the main weapons suppliers to the Saudis. And if Britain, France, and America were not supplying weapons to the Saudis, it's highly unlikely that Saudi Arabia would have been able to carry out such a large-scale attack on Yemen at all. So we play a major part in enabling other people to start and continue and scale up wars. So without the weapons sales all over the world, it is highly likely that the number and scale of conflicts would decrease quite significantly. And this has many unintended consequences. So, for example, the CIA estimates that it provided approximately $11 billion worth of weapons to Afghanistan towards the end of the 20th century. Now, once Afghanistan became a sort of failed state, those weapons are spread out all over Asia and the Middle East. And similarly, when Britain and America destroyed Libya, the weapons there were looted and they're now everywhere. So in many of these regions, anyone can actually get their hands on weapons of war, on handguns, and so on. And frequently, our own peacekeepers and the peacekeepers from the United Nations find that they're up against people who are armed with our weapons. And so people have noted this in Somalia, in Bosnia, and Rwanda. And there's a great example for older British people who remember Falklands in 1982. So Britain fought a war against Argentina over the Falklands. And what people don't discuss very often is that in the 6 years prior to that war, Argentina was run by a military dictatorship, and France, Belgium, Germany, America, and Britain were all supplying that military dictatorship to keep them in power against the wishes of their populations. And they were murdering people, torturing people, people were disappearing, and so on. It would have been far harder for that military dictatorship to take power at all without weapons supplied by the West. So it's highly likely that the Falklands War in 1982 might never have taken place at all if Western companies had not been supplying weapons to that military dictatorship for the preceding 6 years. So if you sort of look at the different arguments that are used to justify these weapons expenditures, so they're often labeled as defense. Well, what you realize with the weapons industry is that everything you ever hear is kind of smoke and mirrors. It's an illusion. It's intended to distract you from what's really going on. So these weapons are always never used for defense. It's all about offense and invasions and controlling populations and so on. So in fact, there are really no good arguments supporting enormous weapons expenditures. If Britain and America wanted to have a military that existed purely for defensive purposes, they could do so with a fraction of the weapons that we have today. And if you look at the arguments for exports, many people say, well, what about the money that it brings into this country? But in fact, our governments pay huge subsidies to these weapons companies to subsidize their exports. So in fact, various people who've done calculations on this have suggested that actually weapons exports don't bring in very much money at all. And there are other countries too about whether you can sell to some countries and not to others. So you can never know whether a country is going to be your ally in future or whether it's going to turn against you, as we just mentioned, the example of Argentina and the Falkland Islands. So in fact, it would be far better if Britain and America stopped selling weapons overseas altogether. So I think it's fine to have the best defensive weapons available, and it's fine to have a weapons industry to research those weapons and so on. But I personally am very strongly against all weapon sales overseas. And I'm very strongly against Britain and America having a massive weapons industry that then enables corrupt politicians to carry out criminal invasions of other countries. So just to sort of round this off, firstly, to sort of reiterate the point that the weapons industry shows very clearly that all discussion about human rights by British and American leaders is just rhetoric. It's just nonsense. Britain and America really don't care about human rights in our foreign policies. And then the final thing probably worth mentioning is that earlier I said the world's leading expert is Andrew Feinstein. If anybody's interested, he's written an outstanding book called The Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade. It's very detailed, but it's a fascinating insight into just how corrupt the whole industry is. Okay, I think that's a good place to stop.
Thank you, Rod. I've read through both the articles again that you've written on this subject today, and obviously we'll publish them on Dorset Iron when we attach this discussion, this interview. And I don't know, it gets to a point where you start to think, this is almost like it's expected now. You expect not all, but most politicians to be corrupt in some way, you know.
Yeah.
Some massively, some less so. You expect large corporations to be corrupt because within capitalism, it's about competition, it's about taking shortcuts, it's about getting from X to Y by all means. And as you rightly said, you know, in terms of the arms industry, the law doesn't matter. The laws are there for us, the minions, but they're not there for them.
Absolutely, yeah.
And there was a number of points that I want to come back to, but I don't know if you've ever read any of the Ben Elton novels from the 1990s.
I
80s,
vaguely
90s.
recall reading one or two.
Yeah, well, what the second one of the trilogy he wrote was, they're basically very environmental novels. But the second one he wrote was called Gridlock. And that was all around the idea that someone came up with an alternative to fossil fuels in order to fuel, you know, vehicles, cars, and that they were murdered. They were murdered by the big corporations who didn't want that at this point because they were making far too much money from fossil fuels. Now, whether that happens or whether it doesn't happen, and I suspect it does, it's the fact that it's very much in our imaginations that the people who are supposed to be looking out for us are actually doing very much the opposite. And in terms of the topic we're talking about today, that means putting people in a uniform, training them how to use a weapon of multiple types, and going out and killing people that they've never met. I don't know if you also read All Quiet on the Western Front.
I haven't, no.
Right, well, it's an absolutely wonderful book written around 1930. And there's a certain, it's from the German perspective, and it's very much, you know, about in the trenches in the First World War. And there's one line in which one of the soldiers talks about the fact that, you know, they asked that question, why is it that we're killing people who we were friends with yesterday, we're going to be friends with tomorrow, and we've never known, we've never met, we've never got any personal grudge against? And I think that ultimately that goes right to the heart of the arms industry, because the type of people who must oversee this murder, killing, destruction, arms sales, they're not like us. They're, I mean, for want of a better word, they're sociopaths.
Absolutely, yeah.
So we're dealing with a group of people who don't know what empathy is.
Yes, so I agree entirely, and I think this is something that will reinforce week after week when we come and look at the corporate activities of other companies, which, whilst they're not selling weapons, they are just as sociopathic. The harms they cause are just as bad, and they don't care. And I thought it was really interesting when you were talking about All Quiet on the Western Front and saying that, you know, why are we fighting a nation that at one point is our ally and then it's our enemy. And in fact, I have read a couple of books by former members of the SAS. And this is something that they actually talk about a lot, that they'll be out training the militaries of another government. And then 6 months later, they'll find they're at war with the same people that they've just been training. And it just kind of is yet another example of just how insane the whole system is. And every part of it, when you look at it, firstly, none of it is like the version of events we're given by the mainstream media. But it's all kind of hypocritical, double standards, but it all sort of reinforces your point that the people who have power are insane. They are sociopaths. And it does appear that we have created corporate and political systems that really do encourage very extreme personality types to rise to the top. And in fact, when I talk about psychology, this is a point that I sort of touch upon, that I think we do need to question, who it is that rises to the top when you have ultra competitive environments, and it's the most ruthless people who are prepared to walk all over everybody else to get to the top, and then they start making ruthless decisions.
Yes.
When in fact, what probably the vast majority of us would like would be all working together more to make a better society for everyone, and for our leaders to be thinking like that. So at the moment, I think that unfortunately, with the response, I don't know if you've been watching what's going on in Australia, but with the responses to the COVID, we do seem to be heading rapidly towards the possibility of police states and more police brutality. And I am slightly concerned that this is the direction that our politicians appear to be heading at the moment.
Yeah, and it's again, I don't know if you've read his book, but The Psychopath Test by John Ronson.
I haven't read that one.
Again, it reinforces this whole idea that those who rise to the top within an ultra-competitive, especially capitalist society, are the ones most likely to have those serious flaws within their personality, so that they can operate at that level without concerning themselves with any of the emotional angles. It's all about numbers on a balance sheet. It's all about, where the next dollar comes from. And all those people that are employed around the world, in this case in the arms industry, if they're made redundant, or if they die, or if they're sick, the people who are effectively employing them don't know them. They never know them. They're just units on a balance sheet. It's not like the old days when businesses were a lot smaller and the people knew each other from top to bottom much more, familiarly.
Well, I think that's sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I think that point you're saying about the scale of business is quite an important thing. And again, we can talk about it in relation to psychology in a future week. But when you make systems bigger and bigger and more complex, firstly, people find complexity hard to deal with. But also, the bigger they are, the more removed the people at the top are from the outcomes of their decisions. And so we've got layer upon layer of elements of the system which all sort of work together. So we encourage the most sociopathic people to rise to the top. Then we put them in an environment where they cannot possibly see the day-to-day outcomes of their decisions. And then we pay them loads of money for being sociopathic.
Yes.
And, we really have to kind of take a step back and say, this whole system's insane. If you wanted to create a reasonable system, this is not how you would go about doing it. We need to start thinking from first principles again about what a fair society would look like, and what a fair system for business would look like, and so on, and to bring the systems that we have back to what I would call a more human scale, so people can see the consequences of their action, and so there is accountability, and so there is oversight and transparency, and so on. And at the moment, we have none of those things.
No, absolutely. No, that's an excellent point. if we can take us all a little bit away from the macro before we finish off and focus on a few micro issues that I've sort of jotted down. I don't know if you remember, and you mentioned in your articles, obviously the writings of John Pilger, but I don't know if you remember he did a documentary back in the 90s on East Timor, and we talked about Suharto and Indonesia. And I don't know if you remember, there's a specific point I always wanted to come to on this, but I don't know if you remember his interview with Alan Clark, who was then
Is this the one? Can I just see if I've got this right? This is the one where Alan Clark says he's a vegetarian and how important it is to treat animals well. But it becomes clear in the interview that this compassion for animals does not apply to human beings in other countries.
Absolutely, it doesn't conform at all to human beings. But he also had that conversation with John Pilger, in which it talks about what you're identifying, and that they were selling aircraft that weren't fit as an attack weapon, and yet John Pilger then put to him that you were also selling him the weapons and everything that can be then added to the aircraft in order to kill the East Timorese and be part of that genocide that Indonesia were inflicting. And I think that's when it got into, Alan Clark couldn't really care less, to be fair, which, it's depressing. But it's also, in terms of, very philosophically, it's very contradictory, isn't it? In terms of there is compassion for animals, and yet there's not compassion for humans. And as you say, psychologically, when in the future we can talk about what is it that leads certain human beings to lack that compassion for other parts of their species, but not so. They do have compassion for animals in terms of the vulnerability and maybe the domestication and all that. So that was just an interesting point that I recollected.
Yeah, well, I think it's a great point. In fact, I think that's a great interview. And to anyone who's sort of younger viewers who are not very familiar with John Pilger, I'm glad you mentioned him, because he was one of the people who most opened my eyes to how the world actually works in practice. And he has a whole host of documentaries that back in the good old days, the mainstream television channels did occasionally show really critical material, and they did show his documentaries. And you could learn about the world by watching him, which is something you can't easily do with the mainstream channels today. But I think the point you make about people can show compassion in one area but are not in others is a fascinating human insight. And I think it's not just the sociopaths that sort of run the country who compartmentalize like this. I think under the right circumstances or the wrong circumstances, if you look at, say, Germany in the 1930s and 1940s, a large proportion of people are capable of just kind of switching off to certain things and pretending it doesn't relate to them, or finding ways to justify all sorts of grotesque atrocities. And I think to some extent, let's say you look at newsreaders in the 21st century, they're all aware that Britain and America sell these weapons to dictators and they're used to slaughter people, but they're also all aware that Britain and America have destroyed Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya and Syria, and played a massive role in Yemen and so on. And yet they kind of compartmentalize that. And so Tony Blair can appear in a TV chat show and be presented as a perfectly reasonable person. And I think we've evolved interesting kind of psychological sort of survival skills, if you like, which enable us to work in complex societies, but which involve actually just kind of blanking out certain things. Mm-hmm. And I think we have not adapted psychologically to situations where we have very criminal leaders doing the things that they do. I think we are some years behind the sort of evolution necessary for everybody to be capable of saying, hang on a minute, that's a war crime, or hang on a minute, that's us committing human rights abuses, and we are not going to stand for it. And I think at the moment it's a few percent of the population who think that. like that, and we need to get to the point where it's 99% of the population who think like that, and it's rare that people will tolerate these atrocities, but that's unfortunately not the case at the moment.
And it doesn't help, does it, that history is just a reflection of the narrative of the victor?
Absolutely.
For example, excuse me, Nuremberg trials, it created 3 new crimes, but it created 3 crimes in order to hold account the people in the dock. Interestingly, those 3 new crimes haven't been utilized. They haven't been utilized almost at all, but they have been utilized in some instances, but only the instances that fit the victor.
Yes.
So across the last 70 or 80 years, the UK, the US, France, etc., have committed multiple crimes that were identified and created out of Nuremberg.
Absolutely.
And yet they haven't been dragged into The Hague, for example, Blair and Bush, as they should have if we applied the law accurately.
Yes. Well, in fact, I think probably we'll have a good opportunity to talk about that next week if we do human rights, because in fact, I sort of make that very point, that the whole kind of United Nations framework of human rights was incredibly hypocritical, as all the major players had broken all of those rules beforehand and during the discussions, and have broken them many times afterwards. And Britain has a grotesque human rights record in its former colonies, you know, with huge amounts of murder, torture, and so on. So it's I think it's a fascinating point. So yeah, we can talk about that more next week.
Just a few more little points. Going back to the role of the royal family, I think there's 2 things that have sprung to mind while you were talking, while you were discussing the detail. Firstly, that transition I think that's taken place in relation to the ambassadors within the royal family in terms of securing arms deals, which is, I think, has made that transition from the Queen to Prince Andrew. Prince Andrew has played a much more prominent role, well, obviously up until recently, but played a much more prominent role probably over the last 2 decades in securing contracts with foreign countries, given his background in the armed forces. Which is interesting, I think, given obviously the situation he currently finds himself in, whether the establishment will go into a lockdown because of how much they owe him, so to speak. But there's also the issue, I think, around Princess Diana, and obviously I don't want to get into conspiracy theories or whatever you want to call them, but obviously she died in 1997 one way or another. But she was also obviously a very big advocate, wasn't she, for the getting rid of landmines and educating people around the world on the damage that they do, and in securing, at least while she was alive in the years leading up to her death, promises from around the world and the UK government in terms of the banning of landmines. And of course you went into that in terms of what you do is you recategorize it, so you give it a new different nomenclature, and you also then let Bush in 2003, 2004 just throw it up in the air. But it's interesting that the royal family is right at the heart of a lot of all this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So again, I didn't mean to interrupt again. So
I
haven't studied sort of the period when Princess Diana was talking about the landmines and what the reaction of the US and American governments to that activity would have been behind the scenes. I'm sure one day there'll be some fascinating memoirs being written about it by some insiders somewhere. But one thing I think is worth pointing out is that one of the things that's always fascinated me is how many members of the royal family join the military, and they have this amazing positive propaganda role, positive for those people doing the propaganda, in terms of making it seem very, very good to join the military and very, very good to go to war. And whenever you've got a member of the royal family, the whole media is completely fawning about them. And if they're firing a machine gun from a helicopter in a war zone that we've invaded and occupied, that's still fine. And I think it would be so nice if more people were able to go, hang on a minute, that's just propaganda. This is ridiculous. Yes. But sadly, I'm forever disappointed. I've met an awful lot of royalists who don't like anybody saying anything negative about the royal family. So their PR and their propaganda is highly effective.
It is highly effective, but what we are seeing, of course, as the decades pass, is an erosion in people's deference to the royal family. And I think I saw the other day there was a pronouncement that possibly in 2 decades the royal family would be bust because of that gradual erosion. But that's of course is another issue. The last thing I wanted to talk about was the nature in which the corporations are involved in multiple facets of the war machine, and whether it's the construction of wars or whether it's the healing of the soldiers who've been maimed. And I think it came to me, just this is a final point, it came to me that very much reflects the American healthcare system. And you talked about the way in which that bolt, and they charge this astronomical amount for one bolt, but that is the nature of the insurance system. It's why it is so inefficient. And yet, for a small clique at the top end of society, they stand to make extraordinary amounts of money off the back of a system that is far inferior to the one that we already have. And I know we're going off at a tangent away from weapons here, but it does reflect the whole insurance system per se.
Absolutely. So I agree entirely. And in fact, some of our later talks are going to be about how the economic system is entirely rigged to channel wealth into the pockets of the rich and powerful. And that wealth comes out of our pockets and the pockets of the government and so on. So a lot of the time when I'm talking about them, I'm saying they don't actually create wealth. They concentrate wealth into their own pockets. And this is something, again, that the mainstream media does not talk about often enough. Now, this is not to say that no company has ever kind of produced good products and so on. And in fact, they've played a role in creating all sorts of goods over the years. But my point these days is that if you look at where they devote their energies, it's much less to research and making better products and providing a better service for the customer. And it's much more to finding ever more complex ways to rip off the customer, to screw the employee, to rip off the supplier, to manipulate the taxes and get subsidies from the government, or to destroy the environment without paying for it.
Yes.
And this, unfortunately, seems to be the way that our corporate systems have evolved and are continuing to evolve and are increasing inequality as we go.
Yes.
And, you know, the whole system, every part of the system seems to be rigged in this way. So I'm sure we'll have lots of fascinating discussions about that in the coming weeks.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And thank you so much again, Rod. Again, it's been riveting.
My pleasure.
Thank you again for coming on 10 by 6, and we'll see you next week.
Yeah, see you next week.